8-year-old Marcus Chen stood at the gates of NASA's Johnson Space Center, clutching a worn notebook filled with rocket equations and sketches that would make seasoned engineers weep. While the world's brightest minds struggled with a critical propulsion system failure that threatened to ground the Artemis mission indefinitely, this quiet boy in a faded dinosaur t-shirt and sneakers held the solution they desperately needed. The security guard laughed when Marcus asked to speak with the rocket engineers. The lead scientist, Dr. Harrison, smirked when the boy claimed he could fix what had stumped NASA for months. Even the janitor shook his head at the audacity of this small child. They had no idea that within 24 hours, Marcus would revolutionize space travel forever and prove that brilliance comes in the most unexpected packages. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Chen sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of his grandmother's small apartment, surrounded by cardboard tubes, wire, and small electronic components that most 8-year-olds wouldn't even recognize. His fingers moved with surgical precision as he adjusted the tiny gyroscope inside his latest model rocket, a sleek creation that bore an uncanny resemblance to NASA's Artemis spacecraft. The afternoon sun streamed through the thin curtains of their modest Houston home, casting long shadows across pages of handwritten calculations that covered every available surface of his bedroom floor. While other children his age collected baseball cards or played video games, Marcus collected discarded electronics from repair shops and spent his allowance on scientific journals that he read with the intensity of a graduate student. His grandmother, May Chen, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner to keep their small family afloat, her weathered hands scrubbing floors so that Marcus could chase dreams that seemed impossibly large for their tiny apartment. She would return home each night to find him hunched over his notebook, sketching rocket designs and working through propulsion equations that would challenge seasoned engineers. The walls of his room were covered with printouts of NASA mission reports, photographs of rockets, and his own detailed drawings of spacecraft improvements, all held up with pushpins and hope. Marcus had taught himself calculus by age 7, devouring online courses and library books with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that his grandmother both marveled at and worried about. She would watch him work late into the night, his small frame silhouetted against the glow of their ancient computer screen as he followed every detail of the Artemis program with religious devotion. Their refrigerator was covered with his straight-A report cards, but also with grocery store coupons that May clipped religiously to stretch their meager budget. The boy who could calculate orbital mechanics in his head still wore the same 3 t-shirts in rotation, his favorite featuring a faded dinosaur that his grandmother had bought him 2 years ago from a thrift store. When Marcus spoke about space travel, his eyes would light up with the kind of passion that adults spend their entire lives searching for, describing complex engineering concepts with the same excitement other kids reserved for cartoons. May understood perhaps 1 word in 10 when he explained his latest rocket modifications, but she understood everything she needed to know from the pure joy in his voice. She encouraged his dreams not because she fully comprehended them, but because she recognized the rare gift burning inside her grandson, a brilliance that poverty could not diminish and circumstances could not contain, even as she secretly worried about how a boy from their humble circumstances could ever reach the stars he studied so devotedly each night. The breaking news alert flashed across Marcus's computer screen at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, the red banner announcing what would become the space program's most embarrassing crisis in decades. Artemis Mission in jeopardy. Critical propulsion system failure grounds. Moon mission. Indefinitely, the headline screamed, followed by grainy footage of NASA engineers huddled around computer monitors with expressions of barely contained panic etched across their faces. Marcus leaned forward, his heart pounding as the news anchor explained how the Artemis rocket's main engines were experiencing catastrophic fuel combustion instability, a problem that had stumped NASA's brightest minds for the past 3 months and threatened to derail humanity's return to the moon. The financial stakes were staggering, with over $25 billion invested in the program and international partnerships hanging in the balance, while Congress threatened to pull funding if the issue wasn't resolved soon. Marcus watched interview after interview with NASA officials who spoke in careful diplomatic language about unexpected technical challenges and ongoing engineering assessments. But he could see the desperation behind their professional facades. Dr. Richard Harrison, the lead propulsion engineer, appeared on screen wearing an expensive Navy suit and speaking with the confidence of someone who had spent 20 years at MIT. Yet Marcus could tell immediately that Harrison and his team were approaching the problem from entirely the wrong angle. As the news coverage continued, Marcus's mind raced through the technical specifications he had memorized, cross-referencing the reported symptoms with his understanding of rocket engine dynamics and combustion physics. Within minutes of watching the first news report, he had identified what he believed to be the root cause of the instability: a harmonic frequency interference pattern that NASA's engineers were missing because they were focused on fuel mixture ratios instead of acoustic resonance within the combustion chamber. He grabbed his notebook and began furiously scribbling calculations, his pencil moving so fast across the pages that the graphite smeared under his palm as he worked through complex equations that most PhD candidates would struggle to understand. Hours passed unnoticed as Marcus filled page after page with mathematical proofs and engineering diagrams, completely absorbed in solving what NASA called an impossible problem. May found him at 2 a.m, still hunched over his notebook with dark circles under his eyes and pencil shavings scattered around his workspace like confetti. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, speaking softly in Mandarin about the importance of sleep. But Marcus looked up at her with eyes blazing with excitement and exhaustion, explaining in rapid English that he had found the answer that could save the Artemis mission. Though she didn't understand the technical details, May recognized the same expression her grandson wore when he solved particularly challenging problems. And despite her worry about his health, she brought him a glass of milk and quietly encouraged him to continue his work, sensing that something extraordinary was happening in their small apartment. By dawn, Marcus had filled 17 pages of his notebook with calculations that would revolutionize rocket propulsion theory, his breakthrough coming in the form of an elegant solution that addressed the harmonic frequency interference through a simple modification to the engine's acoustic dampening system. He sat back in his chair, exhausted but exhilarated, staring at equations that proved beyond any doubt that NASA's engineers were treating the symptoms rather than the disease, missing the fundamental acoustic resonance pattern that was causing the combustion instability because they were approaching it as a chemistry problem instead of a physics one. When May shuffled into the kitchen to prepare breakfast before her morning shift at the hospital, she found Marcus waiting at their small table with his notebook open and an expression of determined resolve that reminded her powerfully of his late grandfather, the mathematician who had passed away when Marcus was only 3, but whose intellectual intensity seemed to live on in the boy. Marcus explained in careful, simple terms that he had solved NASA's problem and that he needed to go to the Johnson Space Center immediately to share his discovery, speaking with the kind of quiet conviction that made May's heart race with both pride and terror for her grandson's safety. Her initial reaction was pure maternal panic, imagining her 8-year-old boy trying to approach one of the most secure facilities in the country. But as Marcus walked her through his analysis step by step, pointing to calculations and diagrams that she couldn't understand but could recognize as brilliant, she began to see the moral weight of the situation and realized that her grandson might truly hold the key to saving billions of dollars and America's space program. They spent the next 2 hours carefully organizing his presentation, Marcus rewriting his most important calculations in neat handwriting and creating clear diagrams that would help NASA's engineers understand his acoustic theory, while May helped him practice explaining his ideas in language that adults would take seriously despite his age. The bus ride to the Johnson Space Center took 45 minutes through Houston's sprawling suburbs, Marcus clutching his precious notebook while wearing his cleanest jeans and a simple blue t-shirt that May had ironed specially for the occasion, his worn sneakers and careful posture making him look like any other child on a school field trip. As they approached the imposing gates of NASA's facility, with its gleaming buildings and sophisticated security checkpoints stretching as far as the eye could see, the contrast between Marcus's humble appearance and the high-tech environment became starkly apparent. But the boy showed no signs of intimidation as he studied the complex through the bus window with the same analytical intensity he brought to his rocket calculations. May squeezed his hand gently as they stepped off the bus, whispering words of encouragement in Mandarin, while silently praying that the brilliant mind she had nurtured would be given the chance to shine in a world that too often judged people by their appearance rather than their ideas. Marcus walked confidently toward the main security checkpoint of the Johnson Space Center, his notebook tucked securely under his arm, and his grandmother following a few steps behind, both of them dwarfed by the imposing concrete and glass structure that housed America's most ambitious space program. Officer Miguel Rodriguez, a stocky man in his 40s with 20 years of security experience and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, looked up from his clipboard as the unlikely pair approached his booth, immediately sizing up the small boy in the faded t-shirt and worn sneakers with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for obvious time-wasters. Before Marcus could even reach the security window, Rodriguez held up a meaty hand and shook his head with theatrical exasperation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had turned away countless tourists and thrill-seekers over the years. "Hold up right there, kid. This isn't a field trip day and we don't give tours to walk-ins," he announced loudly enough for other visitors to hear, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that suggested he found the very idea of a child approaching NASA to be personally offensive. Behind Marcus, a steady stream of important-looking visitors in expensive tailored suits and leather briefcases moved through the VIP lane with barely a glance from Rodriguez, their corporate badges and professional attire serving as automatic passes into the facility, while Marcus stood patiently waiting for a chance to explain his mission. The contrast was stark and deliberate, as Rodriguez made a show of waving through a man in a $1,000 suit, while simultaneously blocking the path of an 8-year-old boy who happened to carry the solution to NASA's most pressing problem in his worn notebook. Marcus took a deep breath and approached the window with the same calm dignity he had shown when neighborhood bullies mocked his interest in rockets, speaking in clear, respectful tones as he explained that he wasn't seeking a tour, but rather needed to speak with the propulsion engineering team about the Artemis mission's combustion instability problem. Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and brutal, a bark of laughter that echoed off the concrete walls and drew stares from passing visitors, his amusement genuine and cruel as he looked down at the serious young boy who had just claimed he could help NASA's engineers solve their most complex technical challenge. "Listen here, kid. I don't know what kind of school project you're working on, but this is NASA, not some science museum where you can walk in and bother the rocket scientists," Rodriguez sneered, his voice rising with each word as he gestured dismissively toward the parking lot. "Why don't you run along home and play with your toy rockets, and let the real engineers do their jobs without interruption from children who watch too much science fiction on television?" Marcus stood quietly absorbing the humiliation, his face flushing slightly but his posture remaining straight and dignified, while his grandmother placed a protective hand on his shoulder, and Rodriguez continued chuckling at his own wit, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just dismissed the one person who could save the space program. Tom Wilson had been emptying trash cans and mopping floors at the Johnson Space Center for 15 years, his quiet presence making him nearly invisible to the engineers and administrators who hurried past him each day. But his keen eyes and compassionate heart had taught him to recognize brilliance in unexpected places. The 62-year-old janitor was wheeling his cart past the main security checkpoint when he heard Officer Rodriguez's cruel laughter echoing through the lobby, and something about the dignity in the young boy's posture made Tom pause and listen more carefully to the exchange unfolding before him. While Rodriguez continued his dismissive tirade, Tom studied Marcus's face and saw not the typical disappointment of a curious child denied a tour, but rather the quiet determination of someone who genuinely believed he had something important to contribute, a look that reminded Tom powerfully of his own son, who had been similarly dismissed by teachers who couldn't see past his learning disability to recognize his mechanical genius. As Rodriguez waved the boy away with increasing irritation, Tom approached the security window with the slow, measured steps of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully, his weathered hands gripping his mop handle as he cleared his throat and addressed the situation with gentle authority. "Excuse me, Officer Rodriguez, but I couldn't help overhearing this young man mention the Artemis propulsion problem," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent listening to engineers discuss their most challenging technical issues during late-night cleaning shifts. Marcus looked up at Tom with surprise and hope, recognizing immediately that this was someone who might actually listen to what he had to say, while Rodriguez rolled his eyes and prepared to dismiss both the janitor and the boy with equal disdain. Tom ignored Rodriguez's impatience and knelt down to Marcus's eye level, speaking directly to the child with the kind of respect that adults rarely showed to 8-year-olds, asking genuine questions about his understanding of the combustion instability and listening carefully to the boy's articulate responses. "You know, son, 40 years ago when I was trying to get my engineering degree, professors told me I wasn't smart enough to understand advanced mathematics," Tom shared, his voice carrying the weight of old pain, but also the wisdom of eventual triumph. "They judged me by my background, my accent, the way I dressed, and they nearly convinced me to give up on my dreams before I proved them wrong by designing a more efficient ventilation system that this very building still uses today." Marcus's eyes widened as Tom explained how he had been underestimated and dismissed by people who should have known better, and how he had learned that the most important discoveries often come from the most unexpected sources. "Sometimes the people with the fancy degrees and expensive suits miss things that fresh eyes can see clearly," Tom continued, glancing meaningfully at Rodriguez, who was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation. "There might be another way to get your ideas to the right people, if you're willing to trust an old janitor who believes that good ideas deserve to be heard regardless of where they come from." Tom Wilson led Marcus and his grandmother through a side entrance that most visitors never saw, his janitor's keycard providing access to the building's interior corridors, where the harsh fluorescent lighting cast long shadows across polished floors that Tom himself had cleaned countless times over the years. "The Public Relations Office handles all kinds of inquiries from the general public," Tom explained quietly as they walked, his voice echoing softly in the empty hallway. "And Sarah Mills, who runs that department, is generally more open-minded than security, though she can be just as protective of NASA's reputation when she thinks it's necessary." They found Sarah Mills behind a sleek desk in an office decorated with glossy photographs of rocket launches and framed certificates that proclaimed her expertise in communications and media relations, her perfectly styled blonde hair and crisp navy blazer projecting the kind of professional competence that had earned her respect throughout the organization. When Tom knocked gently on her open door and introduced Marcus as a young person with some questions about the Artemis program, Sarah's initial response was warm and welcoming, her practiced smile and friendly demeanor suggesting that she genuinely enjoyed interacting with curious members of the public who showed interest in NASA's work. She invited Marcus to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk, speaking to him with the kind of patient professionalism she typically reserved for journalists and visiting dignitaries, asking polite questions about his interest in space exploration and complimenting him on his obvious enthusiasm for science and engineering. However, the moment Marcus began explaining that he had identified the root cause of the combustion instability problem and wanted to share his solution with the propulsion engineering team, Sarah's entire demeanor shifted like a switch had been flipped, her warm smile freezing into something cold and condescending as she processed what this 8-year-old boy was actually suggesting. "Oh, honey," she said with the kind of patronizing sweetness that adults use when they want to crush a child's dreams while pretending to be kind. "Children don't solve NASA problems. That's what we have teams of brilliant engineers with advanced degrees and decades of experience to handle." Her voice carried the same dismissive authority that Marcus had encountered at the security checkpoint, though wrapped in more polite language that somehow made the rejection even more painful than Rodriguez's crude mockery had been. Sarah suggested that Marcus might want to consider entering his ideas in a local science fair where they would be more appropriate for someone his age, speaking as though his carefully calculated solutions were nothing more than a school project that had gotten out of hand through a child's overactive imagination. Marcus sat quietly through her patronizing lecture, his notebook still clutched in his small hands, waiting patiently for her to finish before speaking in the same calm, respectful voice he had used with every adult who had dismissed him that day. "Miss Mills, I understand your concern about my age, but would you be willing to give me just 5 minutes to show you my calculations?" He asked with dignity that would have impressed seasoned diplomats, his simple request hanging in the air between them like a bridge that Sarah could either cross or burn. Dr. Richard Harrison strode through the doorway of Sarah Mills's office with the kind of theatrical confidence that came from 20 years of being the smartest person in most rooms, his 6-foot frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and a burgundy silk tie that he adjusted unconsciously whenever he wanted to assert his authority over a situation. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian leather shoes clicked authoritatively against the polished floor, and his entire presence radiated the kind of intellectual arrogance that had made him simultaneously the most respected and most feared engineer in NASA's propulsion division. Harrison had been walking past the public relations office when he overheard fragments of conversation that included the words combustion, instability, and Artemis Mission, and his ego immediately compelled him to investigate what some civilian was discussing about his area of expertise without his knowledge or permission. As he paused in the doorway and took in the scene before him, his sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation with the calculating precision of someone who had spent decades turning every interaction into an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over lesser minds. Sarah Mills looked up with obvious relief when she saw Harrison approaching, recognizing immediately that the lead propulsion engineer's presence would help her handle this awkward situation with the overly ambitious child who seemed to think he could contribute to NASA's most complex technical challenges. "Dr. Harrison, perfect timing," Sarah said with the kind of deference she reserved for the facility's most important personnel. "This young man was just asking about the Artemis propulsion system, and I thought you might want to address his questions directly." Harrison's lips curved into what could generously be called a smile, but was really more of a predatory smirk as he studied Marcus with the kind of condescending amusement that adults often display when confronted with children who have delusions of grandeur about their own capabilities. The contrast between the two figures was stark and deliberately symbolic, with Harrison's expensive attire and commanding presence making Marcus look even smaller and more out of place in his simple clothes and worn sneakers. Yet the boy's calm composure and intelligent eyes suggested depths that Harrison was too arrogant to recognize or acknowledge. "Well, well," Harrison said in a voice that dripped with theatrical benevolence. "What do we have here? A future astronaut, perhaps?" His tone carried the kind of patronizing sweetness that adults use when they want to appear kind while simultaneously establishing their complete dominance over a situation that they find amusing rather than threatening. Marcus looked up at Harrison with the same respectful attention he had shown every adult that day, but something in the engineer's manner set off warning bells that the boy had learned to recognize from years of dealing with teachers and neighbors who underestimated his intelligence. "Do you have any idea who I am, young man?" Harrison continued, his voice rising slightly as he prepared to deliver what he considered to be his most impressive credentials, completely unaware that he was about to engage in a battle of wits with someone whose intellectual capabilities far exceeded his own understanding of what an 8-year-old mind could contain. Dr. Harrison's eyes gleamed with the kind of malicious entertainment that came from an opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority in front of an audience, and he made a theatrical show of checking his expensive Swiss watch before announcing that he had a few minutes to spare for what he called an educational experience for everyone involved. With a gesture that was part invitation and part command, Harrison led Marcus, his grandmother, and Sarah Mills down a corridor lined with photographs of successful rocket launches toward Conference Room C, where 3 junior engineers were reviewing technical specifications on large computer monitors that displayed complex diagrams of the Artemis propulsion system. "Gentlemen, we have a very special visitor today," Harrison announced as he ushered Marcus into the room with flourish that made it clear he was setting up some kind of performance for his colleagues' amusement, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical authority that he used when he wanted to ensure that everyone in the room understood exactly who was in charge of the situation. The junior engineers looked up from their work with expressions of confusion and curiosity as Harrison explained that this young man claimed to have solved the combustion instability problem that had been keeping NASA's best minds awake at night for months, his tone making it abundantly clear that he found the entire situation absurd and entertaining rather than worthy of serious consideration. "Let's see what our child prodigy has to offer," Harrison continued with mock enthusiasm, gesturing toward Marcus with the kind of exaggerated courtesy that adults use when they want to make fun of children while maintaining plausible deniability about their cruelty. "Perhaps he can teach us something that we missed in all those years of graduate school and professional experience." The engineers exchanged knowing glances and barely suppressed chuckles as they turned their attention to Marcus, their amusement obvious and painful as they prepared to witness what they assumed would be an embarrassing display of childish overconfidence that Harrison would use as a teaching moment about the importance of respecting expertise and authority. Marcus stood quietly in the center of the room, surrounded by adults who were treating him like entertainment rather than a human being with something valuable to contribute. But his composure remained unshaken as he carefully opened his worn notebook and began flipping through pages of calculations that represented hours of intensive work and genuine breakthrough thinking. The sight of his handwritten equations and diagrams only intensified the engineers' amusement as they interpreted his notebook as the kind of amateur scribbling that any bright child might produce after watching too many science documentaries and imagining themselves to be rocket scientists. Harrison allowed Marcus to flip through several pages of his notebook, building dramatic tension while his colleagues waited for the inevitable moment when the boy would reveal the limitations of his understanding. But just as Marcus began to speak and point to his first calculation, Harrison held up an imperious hand and interrupted with the kind of condescending authority that he had perfected over decades of academic conferences and professional meetings where his word was rarely questioned by anyone brave enough to challenge his expertise. "Now hold on there, young man," Harrison interrupted with a patronizing chuckle that echoed off the conference room walls, his hand raised in a gesture that was meant to appear gentle but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to silencing subordinates with a single word. "Before you start throwing around technical terms that you've probably heard on television, let me explain something very important to you about how rocket science actually works." His voice took on the tone of a professor addressing a particularly slow student, each word carefully enunciated as though Marcus might have difficulty understanding basic concepts, while the other engineers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as they began to recognize that their boss was crossing lines that professional courtesy should have kept intact. "People like you don't understand rocket science," Harrison continued with growing confidence, his chest swelling with the kind of intellectual pride that had made him insufferable to colleagues for decades. "And that's perfectly fine because it takes years of advanced mathematics, physics, and engineering training that children simply haven't had time to acquire, no matter how many space documentaries they might have watched with their parents." The cruelty in his voice was becoming more obvious with each passing moment as Harrison launched into a condescending lecture about basic propulsion principles that Marcus had mastered when he was 6 years old, explaining combustion chambers and fuel injection systems with the kind of exaggerated simplicity that adults use when they want to make children feel stupid and small. Marcus stood quietly through the humiliating monologue, his notebook still open in his hands, as Harrison droned on about concepts like thrust-to-weight ratios and specific impulse calculations, topics that the boy could have explained in his sleep, but which Harrison presented as though they were profound mysteries beyond the comprehension of anyone without multiple advanced degrees. The junior engineers exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances as their supervisor's behavior grew more cruel and unprofessional, with Dr. Jennifer Chen wincing visibly when Harrison began using phrases like, "when you grow up and get a real education, and maybe someday you'll understand why the adults are talking." Marcus tried several times to redirect the conversation back to his actual solution, speaking politely about harmonic frequency interference and acoustic dampening modifications. But Harrison cut him off each time with increasingly dismissive comments about children who thought they could solve problems that had stumped teams of PhD scientists working around the clock with unlimited budgets and state-of-the-art equipment. "I didn't spend 20 years earning degrees from MIT and Caltech to be lectured by a child who probably can't even do long division," Harrison sneered, his voice rising with each word as his ego inflated beyond all reasonable bounds, completely intoxicated by his own sense of intellectual superiority and professional authority. The humiliation reached its crescendo when Harrison turned to his colleagues and made a show of asking whether they thought it was appropriate for children to waste the time of serious engineers who had real work to do solving actual problems that required genuine expertise rather than childhood fantasies about space travel, his words hanging in the air like poison as Marcus continued to stand with quiet dignity despite the verbal assault that was designed to crush his spirit and send him home in tears. Despite the cruel laughter and dismissive comments filling the conference room, Marcus took a deep breath and began speaking in the same calm, methodical voice he used when explaining complex problems to his grandmother, his small finger pointing to the first page of calculations as he launched into an explanation that would have impressed graduate students at the nation's top engineering schools. "The combustion instability you're experiencing isn't caused by fuel mixture ratios or injection timing," Marcus said clearly, his words cutting through Harrison's condescending chuckles like a knife through silk. "It's caused by harmonic frequency interference between the acoustic waves, generated by the combustion process and the natural resonance frequency of the combustion chamber itself." Harrison immediately interrupted with a theatrical sigh, rolling his eyes as he prepared to dismiss what he assumed was another childish misunderstanding of basic physics. But something in Marcus's precise terminology and confident delivery made Dr. Jennifer Chen lean forward slightly in her chair and pay closer attention to the boy's words. Marcus continued undeterred, flipping to a page covered with wave equations and frequency calculations that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of acoustic engineering principles, explaining how the combustion chamber's dimensions were creating a standing wave pattern that amplified certain frequencies while dampening others, leading to the irregular pressure oscillations that NASA's team had been unable to predict or control. "That's completely ridiculous," Harrison interjected again, his voice carrying less confidence than before as he struggled to process the mathematical sophistication of what the boy was presenting. "Combustion instability is a well-understood phenomenon that has nothing to do with acoustic resonance. And I'm not going to sit here and listen to a child lecture me about engineering principles that he clearly doesn't understand." But Marcus remained patient and focused, methodically working through his analysis step by step, pointing to specific equations that showed how the acoustic interference pattern was creating feedback loops that amplified the instability beyond the system's ability to compensate, his explanation becoming more detailed and technically precise with each passing moment. The other engineers in the room began exchanging different kinds of glances now, no longer amused, but increasingly intrigued by the depth of knowledge this 8-year-old was displaying, as Marcus moved on to discuss Fourier transforms and harmonic analysis with the kind of casual expertise that suggested years of serious study rather than casual interest in space exploration. Harrison's interruptions became more frequent and desperate as he realized that Marcus was presenting concepts that went far beyond anything a typical child should know, his dismissive comments growing shriller as the boy continued to demonstrate mathematical abilities that challenged Harrison's assumptions about intellectual hierarchy and age-based authority. "The solution involves modifying the acoustic dampening system to disrupt the standing wave pattern," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he sensed that at least some of his audience was beginning to take him seriously, "by introducing precisely calculated phase shifts that will eliminate the resonance condition without affecting the engine's overall performance or efficiency." The tension in the room was becoming palpable as Marcus's genuine expertise became increasingly difficult for even Harrison to deny. though the arrogant engineer continued his desperate attempts to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond his ability to manage through intimidation and condescension alone. Marcus turned to a fresh page in his notebook and began drawing a precise diagram that illustrated the acoustic wave patterns inside the Artemis combustion chamber, his pencil moving with the confidence of someone who had visualized this problem from every possible angle during his sleepless night of calculations. The harmonic frequency interference occurs at exactly 4,237 hertz, he explained, pointing to a series of wave equations that map the acoustic resonance with mathematical precision that made Dr. Jennifer Chen's breath catch in her throat as she recognized the sophistication of his analysis. Your team has been focusing on fuel injection timing and mixture ratios, but you've missed the fact that the combustion chamber's cylindrical geometry creates a standing wave pattern that amplifies specific frequencies while dampening others, causing the pressure oscillations that destabilize the entire propulsion system. Marcus flipped to another page covered with Fourier transform calculations that showed how the acoustic interference pattern could be predicted and controlled, his explanation becoming more technically detailed as he described the mathematical relationship between chamber dimensions, fuel burn rate, and acoustic resonance frequencies that NASA's engineers had somehow overlooked despite months of intensive analysis. Harrison's face was growing redder with each passing moment as he struggled to find flaws in Marcus's reasoning, his usual arsenal of dismissive comments failing him as the boy presented calculations that were not only mathematically sound, but demonstrated insights that Harrison's own team had completely missed during their exhaustive investigation of the propulsion system failure. The solution is actually quite elegant, Marcus continued, turning to a final page that showed his proposed modification to the engine's acoustic dampening system. By installing precisely positioned resonance disruptors at calculated intervals along the combustion chamber walls, you can introduce phase shifts that eliminate the standing wave pattern without affecting combustion efficiency or engine performance. Dr. Jennifer Chen could no longer remain silent as she studied Marcus's calculations over his shoulder, her engineering training allowing her to immediately recognize the brilliance of his approach and the devastating accuracy of his mathematical analysis. "This is incredible," she whispered, loud enough for the other engineers to hear. "He's identified the exact frequency that's been causing our problems, and his dampening solution is mathematically perfect." Harrison spun around to face his subordinate with fury blazing in his eyes, his professional composure finally cracking as he realized that one of his own team members was validating the work of an 8-year-old boy who had just solved a problem that had stumped Harrison's entire department for months. "Dr. Chen, I will not have you encouraging this ridiculous charade," Harrison snapped, his voice carrying the desperate authority of someone whose intellectual superiority was being challenged by forces he couldn't control or dismiss. "This child is wasting our time with amateur calculations that have no basis in real engineering science." But the damage to Harrison's credibility was already spreading through the room like cracks in a dam, as the other junior engineers began crowding around Marcus's notebook to examine his work more closely, their expressions shifting from amusement to amazement as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the relationship between age, education, and intellectual capability. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been walking through the engineering wing conducting one of her unscheduled visits to monitor progress on the Artemis crisis when the sound of raised voices and uncomfortable laughter drew her attention to Conference Room C, her 30 years of NASA leadership having taught her to recognize the difference between productive scientific debate and something far more troubling. The administrator pushed open the conference room door just in time to hear Harrison's voice rising in desperate authority as he declared that he would not allow his time to be wasted by amateur calculations from a child. And what she saw when she stepped into the room made her jaw clench with the kind of controlled anger that had made her legendary for her ability to cut through bureaucratic nonsense and institutional arrogance. Dr. Rodriguez was a formidable woman in her early 60s whose silver hair and steel-gray eyes had intimidated senators and presidents during budget hearings. Her reputation built on an unwavering commitment to scientific excellence and a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of intellectual prejudice that had nearly driven her out of the field when she was a young Latina engineer fighting for recognition in a male-dominated profession. She took in the scene with the calculating precision of someone who had spent decades navigating NASA's complex political landscape, immediately recognizing the power dynamic at play as she observed Harrison's theatrical condescension, the uncomfortable expressions of the junior engineers, and most importantly, the quiet dignity of the small boy standing in the center of the room, clutching a notebook that seemed far too sophisticated for his age. "Dr. Harrison," she said, in a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, her tone cutting through the tension in the room like a laser through steel. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion, and I'm curious about what seems to be causing such passionate debate in my engineering department." Harrison immediately straightened his tie and adopted the deferential posture he reserved for interactions with his superiors, his arrogance melting away as quickly as snow in summer heat when confronted with someone whose authority exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. "Administrator Rodriguez, we were just dealing with a minor interruption from a young visitor who seems to think he can contribute to our propulsion analysis," Harrison said with what he hoped was diplomatic dismissal, completely unaware that his condescending tone was exactly the wrong approach to take with someone who had built her career on recognizing and nurturing unconventional brilliance wherever it might be found. Dr. Rodriguez studied Marcus with the kind of intense focus she typically reserved for mission-critical technical reviews, noting the mathematical sophistication visible in his open notebook, the respectful attention he paid to adult conversation, and most importantly, the unmistakable intelligence burning in his young eyes that reminded her powerfully of her own grandson, who possessed similar gifts that were too often dismissed by adults who couldn't see past his age. "Young man," she said directly to Marcus, ignoring Harrison's obvious discomfort with her decision to address the boy as though he were a legitimate participant in the conversation, "I would very much like to hear what you have to say about our propulsion challenges, and I'd appreciate it if you could walk me through your complete analysis from the beginning." Dr. Rodriguez accepted Marcus's worn notebook with the careful reverence she typically reserved for classified technical documents, her experienced eyes immediately scanning the first page of calculations with a kind of focused intensity that had made her legendary for her ability to identify breakthrough innovations hidden within mountains of routine engineering reports. What she saw made her pause and look more closely, her initial skepticism giving way to genuine surprise as she recognized the sophisticated mathematical analysis that filled every margin of the boy's handwritten pages, equations that demonstrated a level of understanding that would have impressed the professors at MIT, where she had earned her own advanced degrees decades earlier. Her expression shifted from polite interest to focused amazement as she flipped through page after page of Marcus's work, finding wave equations, Fourier transforms, and acoustic analysis that revealed insights her own engineering teams had somehow missed despite their extensive education and unlimited resources. "Where did you learn this?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the condescending skepticism that Marcus had endured throughout the day. Her question spoken with the kind of respect that one expert shows to another when recognizing work that challenges their own understanding of what should be possible. Marcus looked up at her with the same calm dignity he had maintained through hours of humiliation, speaking clearly and honestly about his self-taught journey through advanced mathematics and engineering principles, explaining how he had devoured online courses, library books, and technical journals with the same hunger that other children reserved for video games and cartoons. "I started teaching myself calculus when I was 6, Marcus said simply, his matter-of-fact tone making his extraordinary achievements sound almost mundane. "And I've been following the Artemis program since its inception, studying every technical report and engineering specification that NASA has made publicly available." Dr. Rodriguez continued examining his calculations with increasing amazement, recognizing mathematical techniques that were typically taught only in graduate-level courses. while Harrison watched from the corner of the room with growing panic as he realized that his authority was being systematically undermined by an 8-year-old boy whose intellectual capabilities far exceeded anything that conventional wisdom suggested should be possible. The power dynamic in the conference room had shifted so dramatically that the junior engineers were now looking to Marcus rather than Harrison for technical guidance, their respect flowing naturally toward the person who had demonstrated genuine insight rather than the person who claimed authority based on degrees and position alone. Harrison's confidence cracked visibly as he watched Dr. Rodriguez treat Marcus's work with the kind of serious consideration that Harrison himself had been desperately seeking from his superiors for months, his face growing pale as he began to understand that his career might never recover from the public humiliation of being outsmarted by a child whose brilliance he had been too arrogant to recognize. "This is remarkable work, Doctor," Rodriguez said finally, her voice carrying the weight of professional judgment that could make or break careers throughout NASA's vast organization. "And if your calculations are correct, you may have solved the most challenging technical problem we've faced in the past decade." Dr. Rodriguez studied the mathematical notation and elegant problem-solving approach in Marcus's notebook with growing recognition, her mind racing as she connected the brilliant analysis before her with work she had encountered in classified technical forums where the world's top aerospace engineers collaborated on the most challenging propulsion problems facing modern space exploration. "Wait a moment," she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of dawning realization as she looked up from the calculations to study Marcus's face with new understanding. "Are you Rocket Boy?" The question hung in the air like an electric charge, transforming the entire atmosphere of the conference room as Dr. Rodriguez spoke the username that had become legendary among propulsion engineers worldwide for providing impossibly elegant solutions to problems that had stumped entire teams of PhD scientists working for major space agencies. Marcus nodded quietly, his humble acknowledgement of the identity that had made him famous throughout the aerospace community without anyone knowing his real name, age, or circumstances, while Harrison's face drained of color as he began to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. "You're the person who solved the combustion efficiency problem for the European Space Agency last year, Doctor." Rodriguez continued with increasing amazement. "And you're the one who identified the thermal management issue that was plaguing SpaceX's Raptor engine development. And you provided the mathematical framework that helped the Japanese space program optimize their solid rocket boosters." Each revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt as the junior engineers realized they were standing in the presence of someone whose anonymous contributions had advanced space exploration across multiple continents and organizations, his solutions quietly revolutionizing propulsion technology while he remained completely unknown to the people who had implemented his ideas. Harrison gripped the edge of the conference table as the full scope of his humiliation became clear, understanding that he had just spent an hour publicly mocking and dismissing the most brilliant propulsion theorist of the current generation, someone whose work had been studied and implemented by engineers at NASA's highest levels, without anyone realizing that their mysterious benefactor was an 8-year-old boy living in a modest Houston apartment. Dr. Jennifer Chen's mouth fell open as she connected Marcus's identity with the technical papers she had been studying for months, realizing that the breakthrough insights she had been trying to understand and apply to her own work had come from the quiet child standing before them with his worn notebook and patient dignity. The power structure in the room had not just shifted, but completely inverted, as everyone present began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of NASA, a moment when pure intellectual merit had triumphed over institutional prejudice in the most dramatic way possible. The entire aerospace community has been trying to identify Rocket Boy for over 2 years, Dr. Rodriguez said with genuine awe in her voice. And space agencies around the world have been implementing your solutions without knowing that they were learning from someone who hasn't even reached his 9th birthday yet. Dr. Rodriguez immediately reached for the conference room's secure phone and dialed the extension for NASA's Advanced Simulation Laboratory, her voice carrying the unmistakable urgency of someone who had just witnessed a potential breakthrough that could save the entire Artemis program from catastrophic failure. Dr. Patterson, I need you to run an immediate acoustic resonance simulation based on new parameters I'm about to send you, she commanded, her eyes never leaving Marcus's notebook as she began reading his calculations over the phone with the precision of someone who understood that every number could mean the difference between mission success and billions of dollars in wasted taxpayer funding. Within minutes, the conference room's large monitor was displaying real-time data from NASA's most sophisticated propulsion modeling software, the screen filling with complex wave patterns and frequency analyses that would determine whether Marcus's theory represented genuine breakthrough science or simply the impressive but ultimately flawed work of a brilliant child. The simulation ran for what felt like hours, but was actually only 12 minutes, during which Harrison stood frozen against the wall, watching his professional reputation hang in the balance, while Marcus remained quietly focused on the technical data streaming across the screen, his calm demeanor suggesting that he was completely confident in his calculations, despite the enormous pressure of having his work evaluated by NASA's most advanced computer systems. When the simulation results finally appeared, they confirmed Marcus's analysis with stunning precision, showing that his predicted acoustic interference pattern matched the real-world combustion instability data with an accuracy that exceeded anything Harrison's team had achieved during months of exhaustive testing and theoretical modeling. The proposed solution worked flawlessly in the virtual environment, with Marcus's carefully calculated resonance disruptors eliminating the standing wave pattern exactly as he had predicted, while maintaining optimal combustion efficiency and engine performance parameters that met or exceeded all mission requirements for the Artemis spacecraft. Harrison watched in horror as graph after graph proved that an 8-year-old boy had solved in one night what his entire department of highly educated engineers had failed to understand, despite unlimited resources and the most advanced equipment available to modern science. His face growing ashen as he realized that his career would never recover from the public humiliation of being systematically outperformed by a child who possessed no formal credentials but had demonstrated intellectual capabilities that far exceeded Harrison's own professional achievements. Throughout the dramatic vindication of his work, Marcus remained remarkably humble and focused on the technical aspects of the problem, rather than the personal triumph he had achieved over those who had dismissed and mocked him. His attention directed toward ensuring that NASA's engineers understood his solution clearly enough to implement it successfully, rather than gloating over his victory against the institutional prejudice that had nearly prevented his breakthrough from being heard. The important thing is that the Artemis mission can move forward, Marcus said quietly when Dr. Rodriguez congratulated him on his extraordinary achievement, his words demonstrating the kind of mature perspective that prioritized scientific progress and educational opportunity over personal revenge against those who had underestimated his potential. Dr. Rodriguez turned her attention to Harrison with the kind of measured intensity that had made her legendary for her ability to address institutional failures without destroying the people who had created them, her voice carrying the weight of administrative authority, tempered by the wisdom of someone who understood that true leadership required both accountability and the possibility of redemption. Dr. Harrison, what I witnessed here today represents everything that is wrong with institutional arrogance and the kind of prejudice that has no place in scientific inquiry, she said, her words cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the conference room like a surgical instrument designed to expose infection so that healing could begin. Harrison stood against the wall with his expensive suit wrinkled and his confidence completely shattered, finally beginning to comprehend the full magnitude of his professional and personal failure, as he realized that his treatment of Marcus had been witnessed by the one person at NASA whose opinion could determine the trajectory of his entire career. This is not how NASA treats brilliant minds, regardless of their age, background, or appearance, Dr. Rodriguez continued, her tone making it clear that Harrison's behavior had violated fundamental principles that were central to the organization's mission and values. And I am deeply disappointed that someone with your experience and education would allow personal prejudice to blind him to the kind of breakthrough thinking that represents the very best of what NASA should be encouraging and supporting. The consequences were swift and decisive, as Dr. Rodriguez announced that Harrison would be immediately removed from his position as lead propulsion engineer and assigned to a junior research role where he could work under the supervision of colleagues who had demonstrated better judgment and professional behavior, while also requiring him to complete mandatory sensitivity training designed to help him understand how his actions had damaged both Marcus and the institutional culture that NASA was working to build. Harrison's face crumpled as he realized that his 20-year career at NASA would be forever defined by his failure to recognize genius when it appeared before him. His dreams of leading major space missions evaporating as he understood that he had destroyed his own professional reputation through arrogance and prejudice, rather than any external force or unfair treatment. However, Dr. Rodriguez added, her voice softening slightly as she demonstrated the kind of leadership that focused on education rather than punishment. This situation also represents an opportunity for you to learn something valuable about the importance of treating every person with respect and keeping an open mind about where brilliant ideas might originate. She required Harrison to make a public apology to Marcus in front of the entire propulsion engineering team, a humbling experience that forced him to acknowledge not only his poor treatment of the boy, but also his failure to recognize the mathematical brilliance that had been literally placed in his hands for examination. The apology was painful and genuine, as Harrison struggled to find words that could adequately express his regret for allowing institutional prejudice to override his scientific training. While Marcus listened with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, accepting Harrison's contrition with grace that demonstrated wisdom far beyond his 8 years. Within 24 hours of Marcus's breakthrough presentation, Dr. Rodriguez had personally expedited the unprecedented paperwork that made him NASA's youngest consultant in the organization's 65-year history, a position that came with security clearance, access to classified research data, and a salary that would ensure his grandmother never had to work double shifts at the hospital again. The story of the 8-year-old boy who solved NASA's most pressing technical challenge spread through the media like wildfire, with news outlets around the world picking up the remarkable tale of institutional prejudice overcome by pure intellectual merit, though Dr. Rodriguez was careful to control the narrative to protect Marcus's privacy while ensuring that the broader lessons about recognizing talent in unexpected places received the attention they deserved. Harrison watched the media coverage from his new, much smaller office with a mixture of profound shame and growing understanding. As he began the difficult process of examining his own biases and prejudices that had nearly cost NASA one of the most important breakthrough discoveries in recent memory, his mandatory sensitivity training sessions becoming genuine learning experiences rather than mere punishment as he started to comprehend how his behavior had reflected systemic problems that extended far beyond his individual actions. Tom Wilson found himself suddenly elevated from invisible janitor to celebrated NASA employee when Dr. Rodriguez publicly recognized his crucial role in ensuring that Marcus's voice was heard despite the institutional barriers that had been placed in his path, earning him a commendation for exemplary service and a promotion to facilities coordination that came with a substantial pay increase and the respect of colleagues who had previously overlooked his contributions to the organization. Marcus's grandmother May was invited to Johnson Space Center as an honored guest, where she was given a comprehensive tour of the facilities and introduced to the engineers who would be working with her grandson to implement his revolutionary acoustic dampening solution. Her pride evident as she watched NASA's most brilliant minds treat Marcus with the respect and admiration that his intellectual achievements deserved. The institutional changes began immediately as Dr. Rodriguez implemented new policies requiring that all technical proposals be evaluated based on their scientific merit rather than the credentials or appearance of the people who submitted them, while also establishing mentorship programs designed to identify and nurture unconventional talent wherever it might be found throughout the broader community. Harrison's redemption arc started slowly but genuinely as he threw himself into his reduced responsibilities with newfound humility and determination to prove that he could learn from his mistakes and become the kind of scientist who would honor NASA's mission rather than damage it through personal prejudice and institutional arrogance. Marcus continued attending his regular elementary school classes while spending afternoons and weekends at NASA headquarters, where his insights were revolutionizing not just the Artemis program, but multiple other projects that had been stalled by technical challenges that suddenly seemed solvable when viewed through the fresh perspective of a mind unencumbered by conventional assumptions about what should or should not be possible in aerospace engineering. 6 months after that fateful day in Conference Room C, Marcus stood beside his grandmother in the VIP viewing area at Kennedy Space Center, watching as the Artemis spacecraft thundered into the Florida sky with perfect propulsion stability thanks to the acoustic dampening modifications that had been precisely implemented according to his revolutionary calculations. The launch was flawless, with telemetry data showing that the combustion instability problems that had plagued NASA for months were completely eliminated. The engines performing with an efficiency and reliability that exceeded all mission parameters and validated every aspect of Marcus's theoretical framework in the most dramatic way possible. Dr. Harrison stood just behind Marcus during the launch, his transformation over the past 6 months nothing short of remarkable, as he had evolved from arrogant gatekeeper to Marcus's most dedicated mentor and fiercest advocate, spending countless hours working with the boy to refine his acoustic engineering theories and apply them to other challenging propulsion problems throughout NASA's various programs. The man who had once dismissed Marcus as an ignorant child now defended the boy's unconventional approaches with passionate conviction, having learned through painful experience that brilliance comes in forms that traditional institutional thinking often fails to recognize or appreciate. NASA's culture had undergone systematic positive changes that rippled through every department and division, with Dr. Rodriguez implementing comprehensive policies that required all technical proposals to be evaluated through blind review processes that focused exclusively on scientific merit rather than the age, credentials, or background of the people submitting them. Marcus continued his regular elementary school education while spending his afternoons and weekends at Johnson Space Center, where he had become something of a legend among the engineering staff who competed for opportunities to work with him on projects that ranged from Mars mission planning to next-generation propulsion systems that could revolutionize space travel within the next decade. The boy's humble apartment had been transformed into a comfortable home through his consultant salary, allowing May to reduce her hospital hours and spend more time supporting her grandson's extraordinary educational journey, though Marcus remained as grounded and focused on learning as he had been when his calculations were dismissed as childish fantasies. Harrison's complete transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story, as he had become a powerful advocate for institutional reform and a mentor figure who worked tirelessly to identify and support other unconventional thinkers whose ideas might otherwise be dismissed by a system that too often valued credentials over creativity. The success of the Artemis mission had validated not just Marcus's specific solution, but his entire approach to problem solving, inspiring NASA to actively seek out fresh perspectives from unexpected sources and creating a culture where intellectual merit was valued above all other considerations. As the spacecraft disappeared into the brilliant blue sky carrying humanity back toward the moon, Marcus smiled quietly and began sketching ideas for his next project in the worn notebook that had started this incredible journey. While Harrison looked on with the pride of someone who had learned that true wisdom comes from recognizing genius wherever it appears and nurturing it with the respect and support it deserves. As the roar of the Artemis engines faded into the distance and the spacecraft became just a bright speck against the infinite canvas of space, Marcus Chen stood quietly between his grandmother and the team of NASA engineers who had learned to see brilliance where they had once seen only a child, his worn notebook still clutched in his hands as he watched humanity take another giant leap toward the stars using propulsion technology that had emerged from his modest Houston apartment. The moment crystallized everything that had changed over the past 6 months, not just for Marcus and his family, but for an entire organization that had been forced to confront its own prejudices and emerge stronger and more inclusive as a result of one boy's determination to share his gift with the world. Dr. Harrison stepped forward to the podium that had been set up for the post-launch celebration, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined his professional persona as he delivered a speech that would be remembered throughout NASA's history as a turning point in how the organization approached innovation and talent recognition. 6 months ago, I made the worst mistake of my career when I allowed my prejudices and assumptions to blind me to genius that was standing right in front of me, Harrison said, his words broadcast to millions of viewers around the world who had followed Marcus's story from that first humiliating encounter to this moment of triumphant vindication. I learned that brilliance doesn't come with credentials or expensive suits or advanced degrees. It comes with curiosity, dedication, and the kind of fresh thinking that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about what should be possible. The impact of Marcus's story had spread far beyond NASA's walls, inspiring school districts across the country to implement programs that encouraged unconventional thinking and created pathways for students whose talents might not fit traditional academic molds, while universities began re-evaluating their admission criteria to ensure that they weren't overlooking the next generation of breakthrough thinkers based on superficial measures of potential. Marcus himself remained remarkably humble throughout the celebration, deflecting praise and credit toward his grandmother, who had supported his dreams, Tom Wilson, who had shown him kindness when others showed only dismissal, and the NASA team that had eventually recognized the value of his contributions despite their initial skepticism. When reporters asked him what message he wanted to share with other young people who felt underestimated or dismissed because of their age or circumstances,